115 people were gone. No bodies, no blood, no wreckage. Governor John White sailed back to the colony he'd left behind and stepped ashore to absolute silence. The fires were cold, the shelters were empty. The only thing left standing was a wooden post, and carved into it, a single word. That word has haunted historians for over 4 centuries, and the answer it points toward is far stranger than any ghost story. Today we're going to follow that carved word and see where it actually leads, because the real story behind the Lost Colony of Roanoke is nothing like what most people assume. We'll ask why not a single grave was found when disease and starvation should have left dozens. We'll look at what investigators discovered centuries later that completely changed the picture. And then there's the part almost nobody talks about, a second so-called vanished settlement that turned out to be something else entirely, and what that tells us about why we're drawn to these stories in the first place. To understand what happened, you have to understand what kind of place Roanoke actually was. In 1587, a group of English settlers, men, women, and children, were dropped on a narrow strip of sand off the coast of what is now North Carolina. It was a harsh, exposed barrier island. Supplies were thin. Relations with some neighboring tribes were already strained from an earlier, failed expedition. And their governor, John White, almost immediately had to sail back to England for more resources. What White didn't plan for was war. England and Spain went to war, and every ship that could float was commandeered by the crown. White was stranded in England for 3 full years, unable to get back to his colony, unable to send word, unable to do anything but wait. When he finally returned in 1590, he was 3 years too late for whatever had already happened on that island. Here is the first detail that stops most people cold. White found no signs of a fight, no broken weapons, no scattered belongings suggesting panic, no evidence of fire or attack. The settlement had been systematically dismantled, or abandoned with deliberate calm. And then there were those carvings. The word Croatoan on the post, the letter CRO etched into a nearby tree. These weren't desperate last messages scratched in fear. Croatoan was the name of a neighboring island, now called Hatteras Island, and also the name of a friendly Native American people who lived there. White had actually arranged a signal with the colonists before he left. If they moved voluntarily, they would carve their destination. If they left under threat, they would add a cross. There was no cross, which means at least by that plan, they left on their own terms. White tried to get to Croatoan Island to follow the trail. He never made it. Storms battered his ship so severely that the captain turned back for England, and White never returned to the Americas. The colony's fate was left entirely to speculation. The one man most motivated to find them simply couldn't get there. It's one of history's most painful near misses. Now here's a detail that should reshape how you think about this entire case. When John White walked through that empty settlement in 1590, he found no graves, not one, and that matters enormously. If 115 people had died on that island from disease, starvation, or violence, you would expect to find burial sites. The absence of graves isn't just eerie, it's actually evidence. It suggests the colonists were alive when they left. Modern archaeological work has continued to chip away at the mystery. Researchers have found artifacts, European in origin, from the right period, at sites near Hatteras Island and further inland, suggesting the colonists may have split into groups and dispersed, some integrating with local Native American communities. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It looks more and more like a slow, deliberate migration driven by survival. There's something quietly remarkable about that possibility. 115 English colonists cut off from their home country may have done the most rational thing imaginable. They asked their neighbors for help. They walked away from a failing settlement, joined established communities, and simply kept living. Not a tragedy, not a massacre, a pragmatic human decision to survive. And because they left no dramatic wreckage, we called it a mystery for 400 years. But Roanoke isn't the only story people tell when they talk about settlements that simply ceased to exist. There's another one, set in the Canadian subarctic, in 1930, near a remote lake called Anjikuni. The story, as it's been repeated for nearly a century, goes like this. A trapper stumbled upon an Inuit village and found it completely empty. Food still in pots, dogs still tied up, graves disturbed, an entire community of people gone in a single night. That story spread through newspapers, books, and eventually the internet, growing more dramatic with each retelling. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were supposedly baffled. Paranormal explanations multiplied. It became one of the most cited unexplained mass disappearances in the world. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because when investigators and researchers actually dug into the records, they found something very different. The RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, conducted their own investigation. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The report of the vanished Anjikuni village had, in their assessment, no foundation. It was a hoax, most likely a story invented or heavily embellished by a journalist, then picked up and amplified by a credulous press. There were no missing people. There was no disturbed village. The entire event, as described, simply did not happen. That finding reframes the entire conversation, because now you have two stories side by side. One, Roanoke, where something genuinely happened, evidence genuinely exists, and the mystery is real but explainable through careful historical work. And another, Anjikuni, where the mystery was largely manufactured, and yet it spread and persisted for nearly 100 years as if it were documented fact. Both get called the same thing, a city that vanished overnight, but they are completely different kinds of stories. And this distinction matters more than it might seem, because throughout history, towns and settlements have genuinely been abandoned, hundreds of them. Ghost towns exist on every continent, but almost none of them disappeared overnight, and almost none are genuinely unexplained. Resource depletion, shifts in trade routes, natural disasters, conflict, these are the engines of real abandonment, and they play out over months and years, not hours. A true overnight disappearance with no bodies and no explanation is extraordinarily rare. Even when large populations do leave a place in a short span of time, driven by disaster, industrial accident, or conflict, it's almost always organized, or at least reactive and traceable. People leave footprints. They contact relatives. They show up somewhere else. The idea of thousands of people simply ceasing to exist without a trace, with no record of where they went, strains against everything we know about how humans actually behave under pressure. We are social creatures. We reach out. We leave signs. So why do we keep telling these stories as if the people simply evaporated? Part of it is that absence is genuinely unsettling. An empty place that was once full of life triggers something deep in us. A fear, maybe, that existence is more fragile than we'd like to believe. And part of it is that a messy, human explanation, they moved, they integrated, they survived, is somehow less satisfying than the void. We fill the void with mystery because mystery feels more meaningful than migration. The Roanoke colonists almost certainly did not vanish. They almost certainly walked, deliberately, calmly, with their children and their tools, toward people who were willing to shelter them. The word Croatoan was not a cry of despair. It was a forwarding address. The real story isn't about disappearance. It's about adaptation, about what people do when the world they planned for stops working and they have to build something new from whatever's left. 115 people walked away from a failing settlement and were never officially accounted for. 4 centuries later, the archaeological evidence keeps pointing toward the same quiet conclusion. They lived, and somehow that answer, that they survived by becoming part of something larger than themselves, is more extraordinary than any ghost story ever could be. Which leaves one last question worth sitting with. How many other mysteries in history are actually just stories of survival that we misread because we were looking for disaster instead? If questions like this one keep you up at night the way they do me, stay tuned. There's a lot more strangeness woven into history that deserves a closer look. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.